Hello and welcome to Creating Hope in Our Community, our series of podcasts discussing various themes around suicide prevention in Scotland. In this episode, I will be finding out about the Scottish Government's 10-year plan for preventing suicide, Creating Hope Together, with one of the national leads for the project, Susie Heywood, and one of the local leads for North Lanarkshire, Anne-Marie Darcey. We spent some time talking about how Creating Hope Together is going, its successes, challenges and more. We also took some time to reflect on the 2023 statistics for suicide in Scotland.
My name's Susie Heywood. I work as part of Suicide Prevention Scotland, which is the kind of broad name for everybody actually in Scotland who's working around suicide prevention. But specifically, I'm part of the national team who are delivering on our national strategy, Creating Hope Together. But my specific role is to support local areas across Scotland. And it's not just me, there's myself and two colleagues, Rob and Jenny. And our role is to support local areas to develop and implement and do suicide prevention work at a local level. And we do that in loads of different ways, but generally supporting people like Anne-Marie in whatever way is helpful to help kind of meet the needs of local populations.
My name's Anne-Marie Darcey. I am the Senior Officer, Younger Adults and the Suicide Prevention Lead for North Lanarkshire Council. I am involved in suicide prevention at a local level, alongside colleagues in South Lanarkshire and also NHS Lanarkshire. And together we work jointly and collaboratively in producing training materials for NHS and council staff, but also for local communities.
Scottish Government have created this 10-year plan to reduce suicide, and can you tell us about the plan?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll have a go at that. So as you say, our national strategy is called Creating Hope Together. It's a 10-year strategy, which is quite ambitious. It's a long-term strategy. And at the moment we have a 3-year action plan for that. And we're trying to achieve a lot in those 3 years. But I guess you've mentioned already this idea of our strategy being about reducing suicide, but actually the vision of Creating Hope Together is wider than that. So not only do we want to reduce suicide, but we want to really tackle the inequalities that are, I guess, contributing to suicide risk in Scotland. And the only way that we can do that is through partnership working. Suicide does not sit in isolation, as already been mentioned. So we need to be working with partners and agencies who are doing work around things like poverty, criminal justice, all sorts of places, because it's the factors that contribute to suicide are wide and really varied. So we're working closely with all sorts of organisations on that. And I guess the ambition, as well as reducing those deaths, is that anyone who is affected by suicide in any way is able to access support in a timely, compassionate way that works for them.
You mentioned there, Susie, about working with different types of organisations and even different sectors. So what does that look like? Can you tell our listeners what that looks like?
Yeah, I can. And I guess to say that this is still an ever-evolving picture, because actually there's so many organisations and people out there who are doing their bit for suicide prevention. So at a national level, we have a bit of a structure which we're kind of calling Suicide Prevention Scotland. And that's headed up by our national delivery lead, Heywood Smith, who has the responsibility, I guess, for the delivery of Creating Hope Together. And working with Heywood are a number of organisations and delivery leads. Some of those are working thematically. So we have a delivery lead for children and young people. We have a delivery lead for time-space compassion, which is our kind of approach to service delivery. And so a number of people working nationally to help deliver the actions in the strategy. Supporting that group, we also have a few different structures. We have an academic advisory group. So that's a bunch of really smart academics who are able to kind of tell us what the academic evidence tells us works when it comes to suicide prevention. But the academic evidence is only one part of the picture. We also have a lived and living experience panel and a youth advisory group, who are all people with their own experiences of suicide, who can advise us based on what they have experienced, and that's a really, really core part of what we do. And we also, I guess, then have the wider suicide prevention community, which includes people like Anne-Marie. There's pretty much an Anne-Marie in every area in Scotland who's driving suicide prevention work at that local level and working with a huge number of partners, some of whom Anne-Marie's already mentioned, and some are kind of maybe smaller organisations and groups. And we are really, with the ambition of Creating Hope Together, is to really harness all of that activity and kind of drive it in the same direction so that we're having the biggest impact on suicide that we can.
Yeah, and I guess that brings me quite nicely to my next question, Anne-Marie. So, in your role as a local lead, what would you say are your biggest challenges?
I guess it's looking at the data we receive, looking at the information that's provided directly to the local leads. I know it's in our area, certainly North and South Lanarkshire, Police Scotland, provide ourselves with lived and live data of people who've completed suicide, and it's about looking at the data and analysing the information that we receive, and to see how the impact of poverty, isolation, deprivation is affecting the communities, and it allows us to look at indicators and to see where the money is best spent, certainly within local areas, and where the budgets are best spent. And we know certainly in sort of North and South Lanarkshire, suicide's the biggest killer of young people in their 20s, but also middle-aged men. So it's directing or shifting the focus, I suppose, of the work that we do to listen to what this group are saying to us and reacting, I suppose, in a sense, to what they need. Mm. And it's identifying that in a time where there are constraints, budgetary constraints, I suppose, for councils and health and social care.
So that sounds like a huge, sorry to interrupt you, it sounds like a huge challenge to try and overcome across many sectors at the moment as well.
Yeah, yes, it certainly is.
Yeah, and I think, suicide prevention, as we're talking about, is about prevention, and that is in itself a challenge, because I think because people are living in really difficult circumstances and people are in real distress and in real crisis, and of course we want those people to be able to access the support that they need, but we need to look at suicide prevention further before all that even happens. And sometimes it can be difficult when you're sitting with a limited resource, particularly locally, to kind of make that argument that we should be looking further upstream, doing stuff around poverty, doing stuff around, whatever the issue is, when actually we've got people who are really struggling to access basic services when they're in crisis. So it's a real juggling act, I think, across Scotland to know where should we be kind of placing our efforts. And I think that's why this kind of larger collaborative approach is really helpful, because instead of Anne-Marie working on her own in North Lanarkshire, and someone else is trying to deal with something similar, maybe in Perth and Kinross, we can bring people like that together to kind of share and collaborate and kind of come up with solutions themselves. So I think that kind of partnership working extends beyond a local area to kind of the whole of Scotland.
Yep. And certainly the local areas in and around certainly North Lanarkshire, is all I can speak about, are actually coming together in various halls. People are getting together with workers throughout the council. The Tackling Poverty team have set up initiatives and they go around various churches and cafes to talk to people about what benefits they might be entitled to, because there's a fair majority of people out there that are not on the benefits that they should be on, and they're certainly entitled to, whether that's they don't have the information, they don't have access to means, which could be laptops, computers, so they're there to help. And there's also various community groups throughout, I suppose, the land that are there to offer help and support. People who've been bereaved by suicide are certainly open and willing to look at and to help their local communities access support.
And that is suicide prevention. I always kind of say, Jeannie that runs our knitting group in the local community centre would never think that what she's doing is suicide prevention, but it is, because we know that isolation and loneliness are a huge driver of kind of mental health difficulties, suicide, that sort of thing. So all of that is part of our suicide prevention agenda, and I think it's a really key message we want to get out there. You know, we talk about suicide prevention being everyone's business, and it absolutely is. Like, you know, just saying hello to your neighbour when you see them is suicide prevention, you know. So I think, we could go on and on and on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you said that, Susie, because I was on the cusp of saying something similar. You know, I think, I guess I'm just repeating what you said there, but like, I think maybe a lot of our listeners would maybe not think of suicide prevention that way. And I wonder if that's part of maybe, people are still quite afraid to even use the word suicide, and you know, having a good welfare state, having access to benefits like you touched on there as well, and really, you know, is suicide prevention. So yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, there is still so much stigma out there around suicide. I think it's getting better. I think there's been huge changes around kind of mental health stigma, and I think we're seeing some of that in suicide prevention now, but there is still a lot of kind of myths and misinformation, I guess, out there about suicide prevention, and that, I guess that's one of the biggest messages we want to get out there. You know, talking to someone about suicide, asking someone if they're thinking about suicide is not going to make that person suddenly think, oh, I wasn't, but I am now. The evidence is that is not the case. So we kind of just need to normalise having those kind of conversations and not feeling afraid to use that word and understand that, to be honest, yes, some people are going to need some specialist support if they are feeling that way. But for many people, they just need someone that's going to listen to them and maybe connecting them with somebody else that can help them get the help that they need, and anyone can do that.
And it is certainly still the biggest barrier to people accessing help and support, is the stigma surrounding mental health, mental illness. There are distinctions between both, but it's just realising where to go and ask for support, and obviously that's not always readily available to people. So what we do, again, through, well, I suppose with Susie's role and my own, is we offer training on mental health, from 1 hour online training sessions, which is just about an alert briefing. So it's just to see if someone's got mental health or anxiety or depression, they're able to speak about it, down to the 2-day assist, which is applied suicide intervention skills training. And these trainings are open across North and South Lanarkshire, to third sector partners that we've mentioned previously, but also to local community groups. And it's just a case of getting in touch with probably somebody like me and asking how to get on this training, or speaking to someone, certainly where I am, but we've got first stop shops. You know, that's where people go sometimes to pay the council tax, their bills, their rent. There's also information provided and within these areas. So don't, please, let the fear of stigma put you off asking for help.
Can you speak a little bit about the main outcomes of the government's, Scottish Government strategy, please? Absolutely.
So under Creating Hope Together, there's 4 long-term outcomes. So the first one is that the environment that we live in protects against suicide risk, and that work is being led. So each of the 4 outcomes has got a lead organisation that's driving that work forward collaboratively. So that work's been led by Samaritan Scotland. And when we talk about that, those kind of conditions or the environment, we're not just talking about the physical environment, we're talking about the social environment, the cultural environment, the economic environment, the physical environment, and that's the outcome where we're really taking that broad brush approach to suicide prevention and saying, if we want to achieve this reduction in suicide that we're looking for, we need to be looking at, you know, people's financial circumstances, people's social circumstances, how connected our communities are and things like that. The second outcome's being led by Sam H, and that is looking to increase community understanding, awareness and response to suicide. So some of that stuff that Anne-Marie talked about around the training that's available, that would kind of fall under that outcome, and just trying to generate an awareness across Scotland of suicide, the risks, the signs, and how we respond better to that. The third outcome's being led jointly by Change Mental Health in Penumbra, and it is aiming to ensure that there is support available for anyone who is affected by suicide. So that is not just people who are themselves suicidal, it includes people who have been bereaved, people who are caring for someone who is at risk of suicide, all sorts of people. So anyone affected in any way should be able to have access to high quality, compassionate support when they need it. And then the final outcome's been led by Public Health Scotland, and that's really looking at how that we do all that. So it looks at ensuring our approach to suicide prevention across Scotland is planned, it's collaborative, it's based on the evidence, and as I mentioned, that's evidence from the academics, people with lived experience, people like Anne-Marie who are doing work on the ground and who are generating their own evidence about what works. So taking that all into account, and then I guess constantly looking at what we're doing to make sure, is it working? Is it making a difference? And if it's not, we stop that and we start something else. So so there's these 4 big outcomes, and then under that there's a whole heap of actions relating to each of those, and there are all sorts of organisations and individuals who are kind of leading on those, but we've got those 4 organisations who I guess are taking the responsibility for kind of just driving those outcomes forward.
I want to speak a wee bit about something I think it was the third outcome, supporting families who have been affected. I guess what people might not always be aware of or think of is if you are someone who has lost someone due to suicide, that's a risk factor for being suicidal in itself. And I wonder if maybe you could, talk a wee bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. You're 100% right. I mean, there is a kind of a raised risk if you've lost someone to suicide. So as part of suicide prevention work, we look very much at, we call it postvention, and that is what happens after there has been a suicide or a suicide attempt, because we recognise that there is that risk. So there's work going on. Some brilliant organisations working across Scotland and locally who are doing really good stuff around that. There's lots of peer support groups out there who are bringing people who are affected by suicide together to kind of share their experiences. And I think the kind of evidence for the effectiveness of that is so strong. I mean, I think just we all understand how useful it is just to speak to someone that's been there. And so that's no different when it comes to suicide and suicide bereavement. So yeah, it's a huge part of the work that we do.
Yeah, and can I say that although this work's going on, more than 50% of people who complete suicide are not known to services. They're not known to mental health services or social work departments. They're an unknown group who are not seeking advice and support. So it's that in itself is why we're trying to get the messages out to people, because people, as you mentioned, who are at an increased risk of suicide following the death of whether it's a close family member, child, parent, but there are also the real issues that we're living with at the moment, marriage breakdowns, people being separated from their families, young men not getting access to their children. As we mentioned, poverty, isolation are also real barriers to people seeking assistance. So it's just getting as much information and advice out to people that we can, that help is available. And it's just a case of ask or speak to one person who can possibly be that conduit to getting you the help and support you need.
Yeah.
And you raised a good point there about, a lot of people who are, or 50%, which is a lot, I would say, of people completing suicide aren't known to services. And you highlighted a really interesting point about how, you don't, I think maybe there's a misconception or a stigma that you need to have a diagnosed mental health issue to even consider suicide, but that's not necessarily the case, is it?
No, it's definitely not the case. Suicidal thoughts can affect anyone, any age, any nationality, any religion, any background. People can have suicidal thoughts, and I think that the records are the numbers, certainly from the academic groups, is that people having suicidal thoughts are actually really high. I think it was in the 90% that people can have, whether it's fleeting or not. there's quite a few studies basically saying that yes, people can have suicidal thoughts. Yeah.
That brings me on to my next question, and it's one for yourself, Anne-Marie, of course, Susie. Feel free to chime in. But what are the main trends in terms of people who are completing suicide?
The main trends, certainly, that we've got are recent bereavement. That plays a big part. Whether the person goes and seeks help and support for bereavement or not, certainly the trends, that plays a major factor. It doesn't have to be months, it could be years after the event, they're just maybe not looking for or asking for bereavement support. Long-term illnesses are another cause, pain and people suffering from long-term illnesses. Also, people being recently discharged from hospital, whether it, mainly, I suppose it would be adults have been admitted for mental health difficulties, but also people being discharged from prison. Homelessness, people being discharged from homeless accommodation. Children and young people who've been looked after and accommodated or in some form of care are also quite at risk. Relationship breakdowns, and as I said before, young men are not getting access to possibly their children. That can cut both ways. It can go for young men and young women. Addictions is also it's pretty. It speaks for itself, I suppose. We've also looked at, as we say, care experience. Those under police investigation. Or people who are waiting, who are in work and maybe under investigation at work, because some of these investigations can take up to a year or 2 years to be settled, and they're an at-risk group as well. And also our healthcare workers, police, ambulances, paramedics, I think they're also at-risk groups, I suppose.
I think what you've done really nicely is kind of demonstrate the kind of all the different, the complexity and all the different things that can mean that someone may be at increased risk. But I guess the 2 points I guess to make around that is one, that as well as these risk factors, there's a whole heap of protective factors. There's things out there that mean that people who are experiencing these things are not going on to think about suicide, and a lot of that is around things like having supportive friends and family, and or living in a community where there's stuff going on, having things to do in your life, like all of these things kind of can protect us. So it's really important to kind of recognise that suicide is not inevitable, and just because you're going through something horrendous does not mean that suicide is where that's going to end up. And I guess the other thing is that people don't fit into neat little boxes, and so actually people may tick several boxes on that list, and that's the complexity, isn't it? And that's why when we approach people who are in crisis, we really need to understand what is at the root, what is it that's driving that crisis, what is it that's causing you to have these thoughts that, you know, that life's no longer livable, and let's start to work with that.
And as Susie mentioned, if you've got friends and family around about, ask the question, are you feeling suicidal? Don't ask any other words, use the word suicide. As we've said, it won't put ideas of suicide into a person's head. Be there for them. And even if it means in that particular moment of suicidal crisis, you go with them to the doctors, you're there with them when they make their appointment with the doctor, hospital.
Yeah.
Just, you can offer that support, and anyone can do that.
And I guess just in case it's useful, and I know some people really like to know numbers and things, and maybe Anne-Marie can give us something more specific to Lanarkshire, but in 2023, across the whole of Scotland, 792 people took their own life, sadly. Every single one of those deaths is horrendous. The ripple effect of that amongst communities and people affected, I mean, I think there's a statistic that for every one death, there's up to 135 individuals impacted by that who may or may not need some sort of help or support themselves. And then some of the just a couple of the broad trends, which people I'm sure will either know or not be surprised by is that suicide amongst men tends to be 3 times higher than that of women for complex reasons. And also that, sadly, suicide is about 2.5 times higher in our most deprived communities, compared to our most affluent communities. So, that, I think that gives a kind of broad picture of where we may need to start having some conversations, I guess.
Yep, and certainly for the figures for 2023, here in North and South Lanarkshire, there was 111 deaths from intentional self-harm and events of an undetermined interest, which basically say are suicide, and 61 of those deaths were in North Lanarkshire and 50 were in South Lanarkshire. And we won't get the figures for 2024 until 2025 from the National Records of Scotland. So we work on the figures that are produced on a yearly basis
and
in
I
order
think
to look at the work we do.
That's broadly similar to the Scottish average, actually. The numbers for Lanarkshire are broadly in line with the kind of Scottish national average, so aren't alarmingly high or spectacularly low.
What about the areas, that are, I mean, in Scotland, at least higher than average? How would you... Are they more sort of rural areas, for example? Or? So
the figures, one of the kind of headline figures from this year's data release around suicide, did raise that. Did suggest that there is an issue with remote and rural for, I'm sure, pretty obvious reasons around how proximity to services, loneliness and isolation. And I grew up in Ayrshire, in Kilmarnock and Glasgow. I don't have that experience, so I can't speak from experience, which is why we really need so many people around the table that really understand what that means, being part of a kind of rural community, and why that might be driving that kind of heightened risk. I couldn't tell you specific areas, but yeah, places like the Highlands and Islands may be seeing a kind of more elevated risk because of the kind of number of people living in kind of more isolated communities.
Yeah, and like you say, it's probably not all that hard to imagine why, where there's not, you touched on earlier, Susie, that if there's nothing on in your community, nothing that you can go and socialise or do all these things, that maybe if you live in a more sort of suburban or urban environment, you maybe take for granted a little bit.
Yeah, or employment prospects, things like that. If you lose your job and there's hardly any other jobs in your community, that's going to have a much more greater impact than if you lose your job and you live in a city where there's plenty more work available. Those sort of things, big challenges.
And even access and support for people who are looking for support in the more rural areas. It's about the transport links, and the cost of transport to get to, and not everyone likes to seek support in their local area. They would rather maybe travel to an area where they're not known, to be able to share their experiences or seek help.
Yeah. We've been talking a wee bit about statistics and also the 2023 statistics, and I think we all came to an agreement before we started recording that the statistics are black and white numbers, and they don't necessarily paint a full picture. But I was curious to ask if there was anything in the 2023 statistics that surprised you, that came out of or seems out of pattern with maybe what we've seen in previous years, or is it a similar trend as to what we've seen? Yeah,
I don't think, speaking personally, there wasn't a huge amount in there that surprised me. I think the remote and rural thing was probably new for me, and that comes from a place of just ignorance around some of those issues. And I do think there is an inherent danger in being too focused on the statistics, particularly year on year, because suicide is so complex and the causes of suicide are so wide and varied. It's really, really hard to use the statistics or the numbers as a measure of our success when it comes to suicide prevention. Because, just taking the last few years, so we saw a slight increase this year, but we're also been living through a global pandemic, a cost of living crisis, some element of kind of political instability globally. So maybe you could say we would have expected that the statistics would have been way higher, and actually, although there was a slight increase, it's still an evidence of our success that it wasn't through the roof. Now, I'm not saying that is true, but that's why that number only tells us a small amount. It doesn't really evidence everything that we need to know, which is why we are kind of moving towards a way of working that we're trying to build the evidence of the contribution that we're making towards suicide prevention, rather than saying if we do X, then it means we're going to see a reduction in suicide deaths, because we're just never going to be able to say that that's the case because of all those other things going on.
Something that I found really interesting was that when the suicide statistics get posted for 2020, when the pandemic kicked off, there was actually a slight dip in the number. It wasn't anything to suggest that, we fixed something, but there was actually a small dip in the number of suicides.
Well, we saw it across social media, I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was so much that I saw, like the suicides are going through the roof. And then I think maybe people were just talking about it more, and people became more aware of it. So there was this perception that it was becoming more common, when actually that wasn't the case at all. So yeah, I think we need to be really careful about the messages that we put out there about numbers and increases and decreases and things. But I think you're exactly right. It was an expectation that we would see that rise, and we didn't. And another example of that is that was something. And I think people often say, I would imagine like the suicide rate is much worse at Christmas time. And actually it's not. There's a dip at the end of the year. Now that's, again, maybe that was just that 1 year, but there's always things that's going to surprise us, and a lot of assumptions that we might make about suicide, but it's just so complex that we can't know.
Anomalies are just anomalies, really, aren't
they?
Yeah. Okay, so 2 years into this strategy, then how would you say it's moving forward?
I think it's gotten off to a fairly slow start, and that's partly because we're putting in all the work to really build the kind of coalition, I guess, for want of a better word, of partners that's going to take that forward. So I think there's been a lot of work put in to speak to some of the key partners that we need round the table, build those partnerships. We've got organisations like Healthy and Happy, who I'm sure listeners are probably quite familiar with. We've got people from organisations like that who are sitting on an advisory board for us now that represent, I guess, that wider kind of expertise around suicide prevention. So there's been lots of work going on with that. And I guess the other thing I think that's been happening is, prior to Creating Hope Together, we have had previous suicide prevention strategy. Our last strategy, Every Life Matters, did some brilliant stuff. And what we have seen is a real kind of continuation of the good work that started then and been brought into this new strategy. So work around time, space and compassion, and how we can make sure that people who are suicidal, when they present at services, are met with time, space and compassion. And that started under the previous strategy, but has just grown and kind of really been consolidated and expanded under the new strategy. So yeah, things like that. And I guess a much greater collaboration. I don't know, Anne-Marie, maybe you've got thoughts around this, but I think there's a much greater collaboration between what's happening nationally and what's happening at a local level. And I think that's really, really important because, as I say, we're all working towards the same aims, the same outcomes. So we really need to be working together around that.
Yes, I would agree. We're certainly looking within North and South Lanarkshire and with our health colleagues to bring and continue working with our third sector partners, VANEL, VASLAN, and the groups that they support funding-wise, to bring on board people who are going to have an uptake on training, who will then be able to deliver the training within their organisations. So the third sector partners would work alongside North Lanarkshire, South Lanarkshire, and our colleagues in health, and undertake joint training. and then be able to go forward and give this information and training, depending on what level the person needs trained at. And that, again, will filter through our communities. So that in itself is certainly a work in progress, but it's started. So, yeah.
Great. Okay. How does this government strategy, keep communities and local people involved and part of the project?
Certainly, in the areas I work in North Lanarkshire, we've got 6 local areas. So each of the local areas have got their own sort of locality planning groups, and they bring together local communities and local health partners to find out what the needs are locally, and work with the local communities in achieving their identified outcomes. At the moment, certainly I know as a wee aside, and in St Cumbernauld is a young mums group that had been ongoing before the pandemic, and now they felt there was a need for young mums to come together. They recently had an event also bringing the third sector partners in local areas and businesses within Cumbernauld, and they brought in, as we said, to tackle poverty team. Home improvement, health improvement information was provided, and certainly even at a tiny level, when we hold the local football tournaments, we invite the likes of Sam H, Peer Support, the Samaritans, our health colleagues to come along. They've got stalls available. Again, it's age specific for the S5 and S6 that they can go and get support, whether that's on vaping or alcohol. Certainly the children love to wear the drunk specs and walk in a straight line. That brings quite a lot of mirth from their classmates, and also the same type of organisations but aimed at the older audience, to our suicide prevention football tournament, and we have the suicide prevention message, as I said, at local stadiums, on the partners that we've made throughout the north. Certainly it's about putting information out in their social medias also, and at times bringing in someone like myself to speak to local area teams, so certainly with social work, or to the locality planning groups, so that we can say this is what's happening at a local level, but here's what we're doing nationally, Susie, and here's what we're doing here in North Lanarkshire, to spread the information and what, and I suppose it's to let people know what the warning signs are. For the people that they know and that they love and that they cherish, and about how the warning signs certainly are if there's somebody's expressing feelings of hopelessness or alone, if somebody's lonely or they've stopped doing the things that you used to do, whether it was go out with their mates, whether it was go to the football pictures, stop doing those kind of things, and you're a bit concerned, as we said, ask and help that person to get the support that they need.
Yeah.
Earlier you touched on exactly how you should word that question. You said, are you feeling suicidal? And being blunt.
Yep.
Is the more effective way.
It's the more effective way. Yep. It's just asking. You've already got. I think like most people, you get whether it's a facial expression, whether it's the knowledge of the person, you already know. Maybe get an inkling that there's something. We've all got a wee something in our tummy that tells us something's not quite right. And if they are expressing those kind of feelings, or that there's an issue, whether it's debt, gambling, there's all these issues that can be brought up. But if someone's just not quite themselves, and yet you do have a genuine concern, and they're maybe voicing about giving belongings away, or just ask.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Using the word suicide is really important, just so that everyone in the conversation is clear exactly what it is that we're talking about. And I know that given the stigma, that's really difficult for people, but some of the training courses that Anne-Marie's spoken about earlier are really good at just giving people the confidence to say things like, sometimes when people are going through what you're going through, they might be thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? There are ways to do it, but I think using the word, rather than saying things like, well, you're not thinking of doing something stupid, are you? Which is just immediately going to close that person right down, is really important.
Because they want to be heard.
Yeah. And I think just back to kind of what you were saying earlier about how communities are involved, and I think Anne-Marie's really summed up really brilliantly, like what goes on in local areas. And I think through that connection that myself and my colleagues have with the local leads, we're able to kind of bring some of that work and some of that learning and some of that intelligence to people working nationally and kind of taking some of the decisions around the strategy and things. And I guess it's important to remember the strategy wasn't just thought up by a couple of people in a room. There was a lot of work that went into kind of really consulting with local communities, with local groups, with people working in suicide prevention to say, what do we want to have in this strategy? And so it's everyone's strategy. And although at a local level, people are working on the things that are most directly affecting their communities, the kind of overall aims of the strategy is it's going to trickle down and have that effect. And we are really working hard nationally to engage with all the different groups and organisations that are doing their bit all across Scotland and make sure that we're all working together.
Okay, I guess really my last question, and it's a two-parter. So what is, or what do you feel is the biggest achievement of the plan so far? And I guess, like you said, Susie, it's not just like the first plan. There's been plans in place beforehand, and it's a continuation. But what would you say are the biggest achievements of these plans, if you like? And given that the project, or the plan rather, is called Creating Hope Together, and our input is called Creating Hope in the Community, what are the reasons to be hopeful in terms of suicide prevention?
Do you want me to go first? I mean, I think probably some of the biggest achievements have yet to happen. I think there are really strong signs that we're moving in a really positive direction, and I think that's hopeful for me. I think, but a couple of things that, and I guess I'm speaking from a very personal perspective, the things that kind of resonate a lot with me is this conversation that we're having now around suicide that's about the causes of suicide, or the causes of suicide. It's quite new, and to have that as part of our national strategy is actually quite world leading. I wouldn't put my mortgage on this, but I'm led to believe that Scotland's suicide prevention strategy is the first one that's really looking at that kind of inequalities through that inequalities lens, and really trying to make the difference across the whole of society. So I think the fact that we are making those links with these different organisations is an achievement and reason to be hopeful. And the other thing that I think, and it's not just suicide prevention, I think we're seeing this in different areas, but that I think we're really beginning to change the landscape or mainstream the idea of the importance of peer support. And so there's already been some really great work done by an organisation called the Scottish Recovery Network, who are bringing groups across Scotland who are doing that peer support, just bringing folk together that have got something in common, whether that is an experience of suicide bereavement or previous attempts, and just really building on that. And I think that for me is where there's real power. I mean, we can make big sweeping changes, which personally I think we do need to do nationally, governmentally, but the power of just sitting down with somebody that understands you and that knows what you're going through, I think is probably one of the most powerful things that we've got, tools that we've got. So the fact that is a huge big part of what we are looking to do, I think is really hopeful.
Certainly with ourselves, as I said earlier, we've got the local groups that sit in each of the 6 localities throughout North Lanarkshire, and they're opening up to our third sector colleagues, which is new. And I guess in the times that we're facing of cuts, it's probably the right thing to do. And they're also, I know that I've been involved personally, enabling hubs throughout each of the localities, which the people involved in supporting services are actually getting together to see what support, what type of support and where that support should be delivered within their local areas. So they're up and running. Some places throughout North Lanarkshire are more established. So it's just about the talking. It's about speaking. It's about putting the information out there. It's about providing information. Sometimes I feel a wee bit like a conduit, and that's all I do, is provide information. But But that raises questions, and then someone will come back and once they've got your name, whether it's an email, whether it's like coming here because I met Mark at a previous event. So it's just, you get to know people, and I think that being open to change. And I think we're using the words suicide more freely, although it's a big word for people to accept and understand, because a lot of it is still a taboo subject, and as we say, stigma. But we're trying every day.
And just, not that I must have the last word, but I must have the last word.
I think I'll get that.
But yeah, I think it wasn't called Creating Hope Together for just because it sounds nice. That idea of hope is like the antidote to suicide. You know, having hope. We know that people who are suicidal feel a real sense of hopelessness. So creating hope is just, that's what's going to help us. And I think what we do know is that when people hear about hope and they hear stories of people who have been in that position and who have come through the other side and are now, you know, thriving or just still here, that there is evidence that shows that that in itself reduces the suicide risk of other people. So a big part of what we do is also just really try and share those stories of survival, stories of hope, stories of kind of great things happening in communities, and that's how we'll kind of get there.
Thank you for listening, and thank you so much to Anne-Marie, Darcey and Susie Heywood for their time and insight. You can hear this show again on camglenradio.org.uk/listen again. If you're listening live today, then you still have time to book on to our Creating Hope in Our Community event happening tomorrow at number 18 Farmalone Road between 10am to 12pm. That's tomorrow, as in Tuesday the 19th of November 2024, just in case you are listening at another time. We'll be hosting a range of local charities, statutory services and grassroots organisations to network, share resources and information locally, as well as members of the public, of course. Slots are free, but space is limited, so you can book in by calling 0141 646 0123 or booking via the website. The address is healthyandhappy.org.uk/what's on.